want to go over Chapter 4 of Governing Texas today. Chapter 4 is titled Political Parties. Our first section is Why Political Parties Matter. Texas has largely been a one-party state, first Democratic, then Republican. Since 1994, every statewide elected official has been a member of the Republican Party. The Texas legislature has been controlled by Republicans since 2002. The Republican Party in Texas is divided, though. There are 3 political parties in Texas today: business-oriented mainstream Republicans, Tea Party conservative Republicans, and the Democratic Party. Democrats are fighting an uphill battle in order to regain power, but the growing Latino population gives hope to the Democratic Party's future. Because the political parties play such a big role in the government processes, it's important to understand how political parties are organized, how candidates are selected, and how partisanship influences public policy. A political party is an organization of people established to win elections, including the people who identify or vote for the party's candidates. Political parties help voters make electoral choices and help candidates win. Each party creates a party platform, a statement of principles and political philosophy that a political party promises to enact if elected to office to assist voters in understanding what the party stands for. Because Texas is so massive and there are so many elected office holders, it can be difficult to be well informed about the many candidates, leading to the people of Texas identifying with a party rather than a person. Parties also do things like fundraising, recruiting candidates for office, and get out the vote drives. Partisan polarization, the degree to which Republicans have become more conservative and Democrats have become more Republican, has become more pronounced in Texas politics. This polarization leads to less compromising and greater dominance for the party in power. Partisan polarization can be seen at the national level, with Republicans only appointing Republicans. Texas hasn't traditionally been this way, but with the increasing polarization at the national level, the polarization can also be seen locally, like when Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick won his position after promising not to appoint anyone outside of the Republican Party. People are introduced to the political culture by learning the underlying beliefs and values on which the political system is based. This process is called political socialization. This introduction occurs throughout our early years with our parents, religious leaders, and teachers. They all influence our party identification. Basically, if you're surrounded by Republicans, you're more likely to grow up with Republican ideologies. According to a poll the Texas Tribune did in 2016, 46% would support a generic Republican candidate for Congress versus 39% of voters in Texas that would support a generic Democratic candidate, leaving just 15% that are swing voters. These swing voters, just like swing states, ultimately decide elections, making it difficult for Democrats to win statewide elections. Texas Republicans currently hold all major statewide offices in the executive and judicial branches and a firm majority in the legislative branch. Because there's less competition with the Democratic Party, conservative and moderate Republicans tend to compete statewide for control of the Republican dominance in the Republican primaries. Many political leaders in Texas were liberal Democrats, but since the early 2000s, Democrats have had difficulties finding a suitable candidate for state-level elections. The party is typically liberal and dominated by African Americans, Latinos, and white liberals in urban areas. White liberals are typically concentrated in Austin, Houston, Dallas, and San Antonio, and aren't from Texas originally. While these places may be controlled by Democratic governments, the power really stops there. Again, Democrats are hoping to mobilize the growing Latino population to help them retake the state. Out of the 13 Democrats that represent Texas in the U.S. Congress, 11 are Latino or African American, suggesting that minorities are on the rise within the Democratic Party. Although many Texans may claim they are registered as one party or another, there is no such thing in Texas. However, when they vote in a primary, their voter registration card is stamped Democrat or Republican to prevent them from voting in the other primary as well. One of the most important things a political party does is selecting candidates to run for office under their party label. Candidates are now chosen in primary elections. The parties are organized permanently and temporarily. In each election precinct, a precinct chair is elected in the party primary. The precinct chair will head the precinct convention and serve on the party's county executive committee, whose main responsibility is to run the county primary and plan the county conventions. Also elected in the primary is a county chair to head the county executive committee, which includes all the precinct chairs. At the state level, there's a state executive committee, which includes a state chair and a vice chair. These officers are selected every 2 years at the state party conventions. The State Executive Committee accepts filings by candidates for statewide office and also helps raise funds for the party and establish party policy. Both the Democratic and the Republican parties also employ professional staff to run day-to-day operations and to assist with special problems that affect the party. The temporary organization of the party includes the precinct conventions. The main roles of the precinct conventions are to select delegates to the county convention and possibly to submit resolution that may eventually become part of the party platform. Delegates chosen by the precinct convention then go to county conventions or in urban areas to district conventions, which elect delegates to the state convention. Both the Democratic and the Republican parties hold a state convention every other year. These conventions certify the nominees of the party for statewide office, adopt a platform, and elect a chair, a vice chair, and a state executive committee. In presidential election years, the state convention also selects delegates for the national party conventions, elects delegates for the national party committee, and choose presidential electors who, if the party's choice for president carries the state in the election, will formally cast the state's electoral votes for the president in the Electoral College. Burdensome requirements for ballot access for third parties imposed by the two major parties have prevented third parties from gaining power in Texas. Despite the fact that many Texans abstain from voting for third parties, a few have had relative success in Texas history, like the Grange and Populists from the 19th century and the Dixiecrats and the La Raza Unida Party in the 20th century. Reformers in many cities pushed for nonpartisan elections where the candidate's party affiliation isn't listed on the ballot, so that voters would choose qualified candidates rather than their party. The Libertarian Party in Texas has recently become a third-party alternative to the two major parties. Libertarians believe in limited government and can be considered fiscal conservatives and social liberals. Libertarians are particularly active in some of the major cities, including Austin. While they do not win very many elections, they can influence politics in other ways. For example, the major parties may adopt some of the positions promoted by libertarians in order to win their support in runoff elections. Why don't people vote for third parties? In general elections, Texas, like most of the United States, employs what is known as a first-past-the-post single-member district electoral system. Under a first-past-the-post system, only the candidate who wins the most votes is elected. According to Duverger's law, this type of voting system tends to favor a two-party system because a vote for a third-party candidate generally does not result in a win. The major parties will often adapt their rhetoric and policies in response to voters who support a third-party candidate. Some other countries use a system of proportional representation that encourages third-party voting because even if a party wins only 10% of the vote in an election, it will still win 10% of the seats in the legislature or other representative body. Voters in these countries are more likely to vote for third and minor parties because they will almost certainly be able to elect at least one of their preferred candidates. Many Americans think their vote would be wasted on a third-party candidate, leading to many of them to just vote for whichever major party most closely reflects their ideals. The Tea Party movement advocates lower government spending, lower taxes, and limited government. The movement gained prominence during the Barack Obama presidency, and like I've said before, Texas loves to keep taxes low. This influences Republican primary elections, so instead of running as a third party, the Tea Party is gaining power within the already powerful Republican Party and have won elections against many incumbents and perceived favorites. With the digital age, social media has become increasingly important in politics. Parties have hired digital media professionals to monitor social media, respond to criticism, publicize the other party's faults, and advertise for their candidates. Social media also plays a large role in fundraising and mobilizing voters. Both parties also have websites, www.txdemocrats.org and www.texasgop.org, to provide Texans with information on their platforms and on how to contribute and volunteer. After the defeat of Edmund J. Davis in 1873, Democrats dominated Texas politics for over 100 years. It wasn't uncommon for the Republican Party to not contest major state offices, and the parties that did lacked staying power. The Republicans that did still exist consisted of those wishing to gain political patronage when Republican presidents were in office for positions like postmaster or rural mail carrier, and business people unhappy with the liberal policies of Democratic presidents. In the 1950s, Governor Allen Shivers led a charge of conservative Democrats to support the Republican presidential candidate Dwight Eisenhower. This was known as the Shivercrat movement because Governor Shivers believed that the National Democratic Party had become too liberal. This sent a strong message that many conservative Texas Democrats were philosophically opposed to the National Democratic Party, and that although unwilling to embrace the Republican Party fully, they found the Republican Party more compatible with their views. This led to a pattern of presidential republicanism in Texas, which lasted until Texans began electing Republicans at a state and local level in the 1990s. Texas voters would vote Democratic for state offices, but Republican for president. Still in state elections from 1874 to 1994, the Democratic Party was overwhelmingly dominant despite pockets of Republican strength. During this era, the Democratic Party was an umbrella party that held a variety of groups and interests. Both liberals and conservatives belonged to the party, as did members of labor unions, business people, farmers, and city dwellers. What little political organization existed tended to be based on personal ties and popularity of individual candidates. Up until the 1940s, it was much harder to define a Democrat. The New Deal economic policies and civil rights measures divided the party, and liberals and conservatives battled in the Democratic primaries. Texas Democrats were conservative on racial and fiscal issues, whereas the Republican Party had been founded on an anti-slavery message. That's right, it may seem hard to believe with how things are today, but Democrats didn't support policies for African American equality. While most Democrats in Texas were conservative, some liberal leaders did hold office after Reconstruction, but by the 1980s, the Democratic Party had shrunk to being in the minority. In the 1950s, more than 60% of Texans identified with the Democratic Party, and fewer than 10% identified as Republicans. Voters identifying as Republicans grew through the late 20th century, and in 2016, Gallup reported that 37% of Texans identified as Democratic, while 43% identified as Republican. The trend in voting has been that all statewide offices have gone to Republicans since 1999, and Republicans have had the majority in the state legislature since 2002. Texas is still a strongly Republican state, but Democrats have been making gains since 2014. From 1903 to 1927, Republicans never held more than one seat in the Texas Senate or more than 2 seats in the Texas House, followed by periods of no Republicans or very few. By 1963, there were 10 Republicans in the House, but still none in the Senate. Ronald Reagan's election as president in 1980 marked a significant change in how Texans began to vote, not only in presidential elections but also in state elections, urging conservative Democrats to join the Republican Party. In the early 1990s, when Texas became a Republican state, not only in presidential races but also in state races, by 1999, every statewide elected official was Republican, just 20 years after Clements was elected. The Blue Dog Democrats, conservative Democrats from the South, had all but disappeared as of 2012 through retirement, switching parties, or losing re-election. The biggest losses for conservative Democrats came following the 2003 redistricting cycle that put many conservative Democrats at risk of losing their U.S. congressional seats. Of the 55 Democrats in the Texas House of Representatives in 2013, only 11 were considered conservative in research conducted by Mark Jones of Rice University. In today's political environment, the influence of the conservative Democrats and liberal Republicans is very limited. Both nationally and in Texas, conservatives are disproportionately members of the Republican Party and liberals of the Democratic Party. Conflict exists both between the parties and within the parties. Ideological divisions and demographic change affects the Texas political parties. Disagreements within the parties are especially important when a party becomes dominant in the state. Today's Republican Party faces a split between members of the religious right who are concerned with social issues and economic conservatives who are concerned with reducing government spending. Similar to the Democratic Party splitting between liberals and conservatives in the 1950s. The Tea Party has also become an influential faction within the party, like I mentioned earlier. The factional disputes in the Republican Party can lead to one of the factions, the more moderate Republicans, to move to the Democratic Party. The growth of suburban areas around major cities has changed the urban-rural divide between the political parties. Prior to the growth of suburbia, people lived either in cities or in rural areas. Rural residents were often cattle ranchers or farmers. As cattle raising and farming became more mechanized and large companies bought out local farms, family farms and ranches became less profitable, and many rural residents relocated to cities to work in banks, oil companies, or other industries. During the 1950s, the federal government embarked on a major project to connect cities through an interstate highway system. One consequence of this system was that for those who wanted to escape the urban congestion, it became easier to move to the outskirts of the city and travel by car to their jobs. While mass transit facilitated urban commuting in other parts of the country, Texas taxpayers were unwilling to fund these infrastructure investments. Interstate highways also encouraged the process of white flight out of major urban areas to more suburban areas. This movement left urban areas with eroding tax bases and poorer minority populations who often could not afford to purchase automobiles and commute between city and suburb. As a result, cities became more democratic, rural areas remained conservative, and suburban areas are a hybrid with a Republican majority. As with African Americans nationwide, the vast majority of African Americans in Texas cast their vote for Democrats. Making up about 12% of the Texas population, African Americans vote at a higher rate than any other ethnic group in Texas. During the 2014 statewide elections, 33.4% of African Americans turned out to vote versus 30.7% of whites and only 16.2% of Hispanics. They have the most influence in major cities and East Texas, like Houston, Dallas, San Antonio, and Austin. African Americans have been elected to represent Texas in Congress since Reconstruction. The first African American woman elected to Congress from Texas was Barbara Jordan, who played a major role in the investigation of Richard Nixon during the Watergate scandal. Latinos in Texas have a significantly lower voter turnout rate than other ethnic groups. While Latinos make up nearly 40% of Texas's population, nearly 2 million are not citizens and many more are not yet of voting age. The full impact of Latino voting in Texas may not be realized for another generation. In this chapter, we've learned how even though we typically think of political conflict between parties, they can also occur within the parties. Once a one-party state dominated by the Democratic Party, Texas is now a Republican state. Conflict within the Republican Party can provide Democrats an opportunity to capitalize on what voters might perceive as dysfunction and extreme policies. As the Republican Party became the conservative party, while Democrats became the liberal party, Texas has remained solidly conservative and therefore has become Republican. Despite increasing diversity, an influx of white residents from other states can complicate efforts for the Democratic Party to make headway. However, demographic changes are likely to benefit the Democratic Party. The Democrats have to make appeals to Texans by adopting more moderate policies. Rural areas have become more Republican and urban areas have become more Democratic. The much closer margins in the statewide elections are evidence that Texas is moving slowly to a more competitive political environment statewide. Our objectives in this chapter included being able to describe the main functions and structure of state party organization, trace the evolution of the party system in Texas, and analyze how ideological divisions and demographic changes affect Texas political parties. For describing the main functions and structure of state party organizations, in Texas, political parties serve as brand labels for voters to determine who to vote for in elections that have little to no publicity. Texas political parties also have conventions and committees that help their members organize and mobilize in elections. For tracing the evolution of the party system in Texas, Texas has traditionally been a one-party state, meaning that the one party has been in control of the state politics for a long time. In the post-Civil War period, the Democrats held power in the state, but since 1994, the Republicans have won every statewide election and consequently dominate state politics. For analyzing how ideological divisions and demographic change affect Texas political parties, Texas is a diverse state with divisions between North and South and East and West. Latinos currently constitute nearly 40% of the state's population and currently favor the Democratic Party, although their registration and turnout rates are lower than those of other major demographic groups. So that's all for this chapter. I really appreciate you hanging out with me today, and I really hope you learned something new. As always, please remember to like and subscribe. I'd love it if you would reach out to me in the comments below. Let me know what you thought about today's lesson. Thank you. Have a great day.